Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sheila Katz, and I'm the CEO of the National Council of Jewish Women. We are so excited to see so many new and familiar names and so many new names signing on for this important conversation. So please go ahead, and I see you're already starting to use the chat function to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and say hello. And be sure to click the all panelists and attendees on the chat so that we can all see who's here. And so for those of you new to the National Council of Jewish Women, we are a 127-year-old progressive Jewish organization that works to advance the rights of women, children, and families through education, community service, and legislative advocacy. The National Council of Jewish Women has been engaged in voting-related issues throughout our history. And right now, because of the phenomenal work of our local sections and state policy advocates, many of whom are on this call, we have advocates in 30 states and the District of Columbia working to promote and protect the vote. And they're doing this by championing voter education, getting out the vote through our Vote Forward campaign, and recruiting poll workers, and also passing ballot initiatives. And with that, I want to give a very special welcome to our NCJW Atlanta section, who worked so closely with Stacey Abrams over the years, and many of them have joined us today, along with the more than 2,000 people who registered for this event. And so just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We are live captioning this, and so if you would like to access closed captions, you just need to click at the bottom to something that either says CC or the closed captions button, and you should see it at the bottom of your screen. You'll notice everyone's mics are muted. It's not because we don't want to hear from you, it's to prevent background noise. You can also send the chat to the panelists if you're experiencing any technical issues, and we'll do our best to help you throughout the webinar. And there's a button on the bottom of the screen that says Q&A. Feel free to send your questions there, and we're going to try to get to as many as we possibly can as we move through our conversation. And as you can probably see, we are recording this webinar, and we will upload it to our website so that you can share it with anyone who missed the conversation. And I also just want to acknowledge that as a 501c3 nonpartisan organization, our conversation today is going to focus on the issues at play in the lead up to the 2020 election and not candidates running for political office. And we are, of course, so delighted to be joined today by powerhouse voting rights advocate Stacey Abrams. Stacey is a New York Times best-selling author of Our Time Is Now and Lead from the Outside. She served as Democratic leader in Georgia House of Representatives for 7 years prior to running for the governor of Georgia in 2018, where she won more votes than any other Democrat in the state's history. She launched Fair Fight after losing that election to ensure that every vote counts in the future. And then she launched Fair Count to ensure accuracy in the 2020 census. And Stacey leads the Southern Economic Advancement Project, a public policy initiative to broaden economic power and build equity in the South. Welcome, Stacey. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to join you.
Hi. So we want to dive right in, but I think before we get to some of the hard-hitting questions, since you're here, we got to get to know you personally a little. So I'm just curious if you can share with us what your first memory relating to voting and when you came to understand the importance of voting.
So my first memory of voting was actually being taken by my parents to go and vote. My mom and dad were civil rights activists as teenagers. My dad was arrested at the age of 14, helping register Black people to vote in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, before the Voting Rights Act. We like to tease him that he got caught doing the same work my mom was doing. She was just smart enough to avoid, incarceration. But for both of them, voting was always a power that for most of their lives or their sentient lives, they'd been denied their parents or grandparents, even though my grandfather fought in World War II and in the Korean War. And so my parents were very clear. We were protesters as children. They would take us with them to protest, but they also would take us with them to vote. And in my book, I describe it, I'm the second of 6 children. And so we basically would stream out of the voting booth with my parents, like make way for ducklings. Because they wanted us to see them in the act of casting a ballot, to understand that the right to vote was just as essential as declaring what we needed from our government.
Wow. And I feel like I remember, maybe it was in the book or the movie, I've been privileged to see both, a story with your grandmother. Do you know what I'm referring to?
I do.
Are you comfortable sharing that?
Sure. So when I was running for governor in 2018, I live here in Georgia. My parents at the time, my grandmother, they were living in Mississippi. My grandmother lived with my mom and dad. It's my father's mother, and she'd been ill. And so I wanted to go home and see her. I wanted to go visit her before the end of the campaign because unfortunately she passed away in January of 2019. And so it was a prescient visit. But when I went to see her in September, it was just as the conversation about voter suppression in Georgia was hitting a fever pitch. There was an AP story about the 53,000 voters whose applications to register had been held hostage. It was the beginning of coverage of all of the different tactics of voter suppression that were assailing Georgia. And she was watching all of this on MSNBC and was very righteously indignant on my behalf. So I went to see her and I was sitting beside her, and we started talking about the fact that I was running for governor and how proud she was and how she just never expected that to be the outcome of what she and my grandfather and my entire lineage had been a part of. But in the midst of that conversation, she squeezed my hand and she told me about the first time she voted. And it was after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in '65. But what many people don't realize is that despite the passage of the VRA, it was still years before many African Americans were actually able to utilize the right to vote. And so the first election she could participate in was in 1968. It was a presidential election. And she told me about how she was afraid to go and vote. She was sitting in her bedroom paralyzed by fear because she remembered the dogs and the hoses. She remembered just the viciousness of Jim Crow and the obstacles to voting. And even though the law had been passed, and even though it had been 3 years, she still didn't believe it was real. And she was afraid. It took my grandfather chiding her and nudging her to get her to come to the front room. He came back and got her and they went to vote. But what stuck with me was that my grandmother was afraid of her power, that having born children and having survived Jim Crow in Mississippi, what terrified her the most was the possibility that her citizenship was going to be made real for the first time.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. And we say in the Jewish world, when people pass, may their memory be a blessing. So we know our memory is a blessing because of the work that you're doing to continue her legacy. And I want to dive right into your race in Georgia because so many of us watched you run for governor. And as we just heard, you have this legacy in your family of like the ducklings, everybody going to vote and excited. And also your grandmother who has experienced like the real trauma in this country of not being able to vote and then being scared to vote. And so it seems like you may have spent your whole life building up to this very critical moment, only for us then to hear reports of voter suppression that may have impacted the very results of the election you were running for. And so I'm curious what that was like for you, given your upbringing, and also if you could walk us through how voter ID laws, moving polling places, changing voting hours, all these things that seem innocuous, how these efforts keep people from the polls and why that matters.
Sure. In 2017, when I declared my intention to run, my campaign team and I really honed in on the fact that voter suppression was going to be one of the obstacles we faced, as real and as relevant as any actual opponent in the race, either in the primary or in the general election. And in part, we knew this to be true because I had been in a bit of a pitched battle with the Secretary of State, who was one of the candidates on the Republican side running for governor, since I'd started an organization called the New Georgia Project to register voters of color in 2014. And I'm a daughter of the South, so I'm very aware of our history, and I want to connect the dots in this way. I was a 17-year-old at Spelman College in Atlanta, setting up a table in Manley Plaza at our college, trying to register my fellow students to vote, being roundly ignored by all of them because I'd been raised to believe in the right to vote. But for most of my time, from the age of 17 and basically till 2013, my mission was expanding access, expanding voting participation, engaging young people and communities of color in civic engagement. because the Voting Rights Act provided this protection that I was born taking advantage of. I believed that there was the protection of my right to vote, and so my job was to expand access. But by the time we get to 2017, when I'm running for governor, the Voting Rights Act has been eviscerated. There has been, at that point, an 18-year attempt and assault on the right to vote that had largely come from one party. And let's be clear, voter suppression has been the tactic used by multiple parties. Democrats used it during Jim Crow. Republicans have been the more attendant purveyors of it in recent years. But the Whigs used it when the country was started. So it's always been a tactic. And I don't want to describe this as a partisan issue, except to say that parties use it to hold power. And it doesn't really matter which party is using it, because no matter who is doing it, no matter who is managing the process, it is still wrong. And voter suppression always has three pieces to it. Who can register and stay on the rolls? And this is critical because in the United States, registration is your point of entry into the conversation of voting. It is your key to the franchise. And so voter suppression will always implicate who can register and can they stay on the rolls, which is why voter purging is also so relevant. When you can be taken off of the rolls, not because you're dead, not because you've moved, but because you've not voted enough in recent years. It's the only right in America you can lose simply for not using it. So can you register and stay on the rolls? The second part of voter suppression is, can you cast a ballot? And that really applies to whether your polling places stay open. In the wake of the Voting Rights Act evisceration in 2013, we know that 1,688 polling places shut down just in the former Confederate states, not to mention the national challenge of polling places shutting down. In Georgia alone, when the Secretary of State oversaw the closure of 214 polling places, between 50 to 85,000 people were not able to cast a ballot because they literally could not physically cast one. And then you have the challenge that we are seeing in real time with access to vote by mail. In the midst of a pandemic, if you live in a state that does not permit you to vote by mail with no excuses, if you live in Texas or Alabama, where you have to be or New Hampshire, where there are strict limits on who can have access to absentee ballots, then sometimes the reality is you cannot cast a ballot. So it's, can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast a ballot? And the third issue is, can your ballot get counted? And we have seen this, I used to jokingly refer to it as Florida, but it's been true across the country. We know that just in the primaries, more than 500,000 absentee ballots that had been duly filled out and submitted were rejected. We know that if you are Black or Latino, you are twice as likely to have your absentee ballot rejected. If you are a young person, you are 5 times more likely to have that ballot rejected. And so that means your vote doesn't count. Voter suppression exists across this country. It is not endemic to the South, but it always fits into one of those 3 categories. Can you register and stay on the rolls? Can you cast your ballot, or does your ballot get counted? If there is any impediment to one of those 3, then you are or all of the above, you are facing voter suppression, and that is wrong in the United States.
Yes, amen. So you already touched on racial justice just a little bit, but I want to acknowledge that we recently commemorated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which really gave white women, white wealthy women, access to vote. And it took, as your grandmother experienced, in nearly 50 years for Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act. And so I'm just curious, if you shared somewhat already, can you talk a little bit about the intersection of voting rights and racial justice? How do they fit into the larger conversation that so many of us are having right now?
We have to begin with the original sin of voter suppression that's embedded in the Constitution. The Constitution explicitly says that Blacks are subhuman. Essentially, it's the 3/5 compromise, this notion that we were not whole persons. That is the beginning of this racial animus. American Indians were not even included in the census because they were not considered and did not become citizens of our country for centuries. And women were told to be silent. So the only people who could vote at the inception of our country were white men who owned property. And sometimes that property included the ownership of slaves. So if you fast forward, 1870 was the first time that blacks had the right to vote as a matter of law. That was the passage of the 15th Amendment. Fast forward again, you get to 1920, white women get the right to vote. 1924, Native Americans finally gained citizenship in the United States. And we often elide that reality, but that happened. And to take a step back, in 1790, the United States passed the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said that only white immigrants of good character could be admitted to the United States. And so if you were Latino, if you were Asian American, you were never going to be, if you were Asian, you were never going to be admitted as even an immigrant to the United States. So race has been at the core of who is considered an American from the beginning. When you get to when we look at the progress that we've made in terms of constitutional action, what it doesn't fully grasp is that while the Constitution may have said, yes, you have this right, it delegated to the states how that right was administered. And so the intersection of voting rights and racial animus and racial injustice has always been that the very purveyors of discrimination have been the determiners of whether you actually had real usage of your right to vote. And so you have the Mississippi Plan, which essentially said, we're not going to use race as a predicate for stopping you from voting in the wake of the 15th Amendment, but we're going to say that you can only vote without paying a poll tax if your grandfather could vote, which meant if you were black, your grandfather by law could not have voted, which meant that white people were exempted from poll taxes and black and brown people had to pay them. And let's be clear, a poll tax was often a week or a month's wages, just to have the ability to participate possibly in an election. And so if we think about it in the context of today, this has always been about who has power in this country, who has the power to intercede, who has the power to be heard, but also who has the power to demand change. And that protest, which often happens in the streets, does not get converted into policy unless the very protesters have the right to be heard at the ballot box. And so when we seek racial reckoning and racial justice, the right of people of color to participate in elections must be held sacrosanct, because typically they are the leaders. We are the leaders in demanding access. And if that right to vote is impeded, our ability to seek and attain justice is eliminated.
It sounds a lot like what we were talking about of how it all started in people not being seen as equal. And if you're not being seen as equal and you don't have equal access, then you can't participate in democracy in the same way. So thank you for highlighting it. You mentioned the census. So I just have to ask, knowing your work, 2020 is a census year, and you've done so much work ensuring that communities across Georgia are counted and others. So can you just share to this group, why does the census matter? And then just to hear your thoughts a bit, we're clearly in the middle of a global health pandemic, on top of this announcement that the census might end early. And so what do you think is the possibility of a fair and complete count with all of these variables happening?
In my book, Our Time Is Now, I spend the first 5 chapters talking about voter suppression. But then I talk about the census because in my mind, they are inextricably linked. The census is the most misunderstood, or worse, least understood part of our democracy. And the reason it matters so much is it's how we tell the story of America. It is the original census is in the Constitution. The first census was conducted in 1790, and that count determined how all of the resources in our country would be allocated, economic and political. And so when you think about what the census does, it is how we determine the allocation of economic power, how we determine the allocation of political power, but also how we map and plan for the next decade. We count children because we need to know how many schools we have to have, how many classrooms we need to fill. And we need to know when they're 6, where they're going to be when they're 16. And if we undercount communities, what we find are crowded classrooms, under-resourced teachers. We find lack of school lunches. And so we have to think about the census as the roadmap that we draw for ourselves for the next decade. Unfortunately, in 2020, what we have faced is an irascible and mean-spirited attack on the very notion of the truth of the census. It began with, and I know this is a nonpartisan conversation, but it's a factual statement that the Trump administration began its intersection with the census by pushing forward a citizenship question that, according to their own documents, was designed to make the United States look whiter and more Republican. Luckily, the Supreme Court struck down that question, but the problem was the question was only one facet of the attempt to undermine the census. There was also an underfunding of the census to the tune of $5 billion that was so egregious that the GAO and the Inspector General said that the census was likely going to be completely wrong if they did not get the resources they needed. It was given a red flag. Fast forward to today, and we know that the census has not been properly managed. And this is why. We knew that COVID-19, once it hit, would cause challenges to the census. And I want to give very, very strong credit to the career Census Bureau workers who've been doing their best to meet this challenge. But they have been undermined by political appointees and by political decisions that ignore the data. Right now, we have about a 65, 66% self-response rate. That's Americans saying, or people in the United States saying who they are, where they live. We have what's called the non-response follow-up period when the enumerators come and knock on your doors. That period is ongoing, but it's usually a 75-day process. It's been truncated to 45 days, which is bad enough, but it's 45 days after having not participated fully in the census throughout the year because of COVID. And so what we know is that according to the last data that we were allowed to see from the Trump administration, Native Americans are currently lagging behind white participants in being counted by 25%. For Asians, it's 2%. For Latinos, it's 11%. And for Blacks, it's 14%. What this means is that those communities will not receive their proportionate share of resources. Imagine if you didn't get 25% of what your paycheck said you needed. So you know your paycheck is supposed to pay you X, but they're going to remove 25% just because, or 14%. As we head into a COVID recovery that will allocate trillions of dollars, and then amplify the fact that communities of color, namely Latino, African American, and Native American, have been disproportionately harmed by COVID-19. The last piece is this. The political power of the census is critical. We know that reapportionment, rejiggering of the 435 members of Congress will be impacted. But what also happens is that the same data is used to draw your state legislative lines, your city council, your county commission, your school board. If those numbers erase communities of color, if it undercounts rural communities, then when those lines are drawn at every level of government, the United States districts, those districts at every level of government are going to be whiter, and they're going to be less representative of the very populations that need to be heard, because we're at a demographic inflection point where this is the moment where people of color have finally reached a critical mass where their ability to participate can actually lead to real change. And so if you believe in racial justice, then you have to believe in an accurate census. But right now, because of the Trump administration, we are on track to have the least accurate census in modern American history, and that's according to the Census Bureau itself.
Yeah, and as you said, it's going to impact us for the next decade and perhaps more, especially in this crucial time when people really need these resources. So everybody fill out the census. That's a first takeaway here, and a good segue into, you've got a lot of advocates on the call and people who care about voting already. They want to do their part. They want to get other people inspired. So how do we actually make sure everybody does vote this coming November? What's your best advice for setting up a voting plan, given everything happening in the world? How might that be different than other years?
So one, do not panic. No matter what you hear from the news, no matter what shenanigans, chicanery, or just bad action is being proposed or executed, do not panic. Because when we panic, we tend to make mistakes, or worse, we become afraid and we take ourselves out of the process. And when I say do not panic, I mean don't repeat panic, don't retweet panic, don't repost panic, Don't respond to panic in a way that says that it's legitimate, because what happens when we repeat the narratives we hear, people don't hear what you intend. They hear what they have heard before. Repetition penetrates our thinking long before information does. And so when we try to solve a problem by repeating what the problem is, what people hear is, oh my God, it really is a problem. And so we have to first not panic. Number two, we have to make a plan. If you go to allinforvoting.com, we have the full panoply of resources for you. How to check your registration, make sure you're still registered and that you're still on the rolls. And do not believe that it is so just because it was. I actually have a staffer who was actively involved in my campaign in 2018 who just discovered she'd been purged from the rolls. So it can happen to anyone. So make sure you're still registered and you're on the rolls. Number two, find out what the voting rules are in your state. Don't listen to someone from another state. Find out the rules in your state. There are about 41 states that permit no excuses, vote by mail. Vote by mail is good. Hear me clearly. I know there's been a lot of histrionics around it, and legitimately so, but the bottom line is voting by mail is the safest and most accessible way to vote in about 41 states. If it wasn't so useful, you wouldn't be hearing so many attacks on it. So that's usually a good marker that it's something you want to do. So make your plan to vote by mail. Make sure you know the rules in your state. Allinforvoting.com can tell you. Once you've done that, the second thing is to make your backup plan. In 40 states in the United States, you can vote early in person. If you're in one of those states, plan to vote by mail, but figure out what would happen if your vote by mail didn't work out. So know how to vote early in person. Unlike what we've heard from some, do not plan to do both. Just have a plan in case one doesn't work. Then your third is everyone who is legally eligible to vote can vote on election day. Make your plan for election day voting. And the reason these three separate plans are so important is that we don't know what will go wrong. And the only way they can stop us is if we are caught flat-footed and surprised. For my purposes, I plan to vote by mail during the June primary here in Georgia. Got my ballot finally, filled it out front and back, got ready to return it, and the return envelope was sealed shut. In Georgia, if I'd steamed it open or slid it open, it would have invalidated it. So I called and asked for another envelope. Shockingly, one never arrived. I had a backup plan. My backup plan was to vote early. I didn't have a chance to vote early because there was some emergency I didn't foresee, but I knew where I needed to vote on election day. And so on June 9th, I cast my ballot. So I am a perfect example of why you need to have a plan, a backup plan, and a backup to your backup plan. If we do those things by going to allinforvoting.com, every vote can be cast and every vote can be counted if we fight hard enough.
Great. And I love the advice, actually, that the voting plan starts by making sure that you're even there. So check, double check, triple check. Thank you. And then just also in this call, we've got about 60 sections of NCJW around the country. And so in addition to individuals, we've got a lot of people thinking about what their particular organization could be doing. And so do you have any advice for NCJW sections and leaders who are doing like community-wide outreach?
Encourage everyone to make a plan. And particularly in this moment where so much is being done virtually, I would have a convening where people get on and they make their plans together. We need to make this a community activity. Have your friends, have your family, have your frenemies, have people who owe you money, people you owe money, people you're mad at, people you're still angry with but don't remember why. Everyone needs to be engaged. And so it's not enough to say make a plan. Have people make their plans and post their plans. Have them share their plans and then encourage them, have competitions to see how many people can, encourage plan making, and you see how many people they can get to post it. We need to turn making a plan into the action du jour of this election, because when we have this activation, it does two things. One, we know people are doing it, but two, it reinforces the urgency of this election in a way that can be fun and accessible. All In for Voting, the documentary, Our Time Is Now, the book, neither are designed to scare people. They're designed to inform people. You cannot fight an enemy you don't understand. But what I want people to know, and what I think can be so useful for these chapters, is that you become the voices of reason and of information. And the best way to cut through fear is to give people righteous indignation and then the weapons they need to fight back. And that happens when you have your plan.
Yes. Okay. We're all going to have a voting plan parties and go to your website. So, so we have a ton of questions that have come in. I'll try to theme them together, but I definitely want to just start with our mutual friend who wrote in, NCJW Atlanta Section President Sherry Frank. And so Sherry says, in many of our communities, they're facing, employment issues, hunger, serious health issues due to COVID-19, and giving that this voting might not be top of mind for some, and it might be feeling physically impossible for others. So can you help her and others who are curious understand the challenge of reaching people dealing with these crises, and how can we get them to vote?
One, we have to be intentional. We can't wait for those communities to come to us. And I know Sherry is a master of outreach. Part of the responsibility is for us to figure out who needs to hear from us and how they can hear from us best. And sometimes it's by not being the delivery system for the information. It's about supporting the delivery systems that people listen to. So that's the first piece. Figure out how to best contact those communities and be comfortable knowing it may not be you, but you may be the purveyor. Number two, it's telling the truth about what voting is and what voting is not. Voting is not a magic solution. We don't elect saviors in our country. What we elect are people who are willing to work, but that can only happen if we put them to work and we hold them accountable. And so I don't talk about voting as this panacea. It's not a magic pill that's going to solve all of the ills of our society. It's part of a process. And particularly in this moment, we have to be willing to protest in the streets, protest at the ballot box, and then protest at the committee meeting. And we've got to see this as a process, and we have to talk about it as a process. Because if you are despondent, if you are economically depressed, if you are physically overwhelmed by what 2020 has already done to us, and that's before they discover that there's a volcano in Atlanta or something, yes. You have to meet people where they are, and you have to tell them the truth about what they face so they believe that their impact can actually be real. So I don't ask people to vote by saying, if you vote, then the world changes. I say, please vote, because without your vote, the world never changes. If you want the recovery that can come, if you want those resources, then you can either elect someone who says they're planning to help you, or you can be silent and know they don't plan to help you. You can, and it shouldn't be a lecture. It should be a conversation. Ask people what they need and then offer them the connective tissue between what they need and who they can be voting for. When I talk to young people who are engaged in the anti-police brutality field, I don't tell them just go vote. I talk to them about the fact that if you care about what police officers may be doing, you need to make sure you know who the mayor and the city council are, because they control the police. But you also need to vote in this election cycle for the DA, because the district attorney decides who gets charged and how. And you need to vote for judges, because they decide how long you go to jail for, if you go at all. And so it's taking these things that so many of us who are civically engaged take for granted. It's breaking it down and not turning it into a lecture, but sharing information, but doing so in a way that's respectful of the challenges that people face, and that recognizes that sometimes this feels so overwhelming, they don't believe there can be an answer. My response is, there is no perfect solution, but silence gives people permission to continue to treat us the way they do.
Yes, it ties in Judaism. We often say that being silent is being complicit. And so there is a deep connection here to Jewish tradition and our responsibility to be able to speak up in this moment for us, but for vulnerable people as well, and to make sure we're all doing our part. I am getting a lot of questions about the post office. Okay. That might not be a surprise. Some about like removal of mailboxes that they're hearing about. We had one in the chat about the fires on the West Coast actually impacting the post office. You already talked a little bit about mail-in voting that people are feeling concerned about, but with talks of defunding post office and everything we're seeing in the news, what do you make of the current conversation about the post office, and what can any of the folks do on the call right now to make sure that they're advocating properly to ensure our mail is continuing smoothly?
So there truly was a coordinated effort to stop people from using mail in order to vote. And despite the testimony from Louis DeJoy, the evidence of our eyes and the subsequent information that has been received demonstrates that that truly was the intention. That said, because of the raised voices and the demands for action, they've backed off by and large. It is still not perfect, but it's much better than it was. For example, they attempted to send out this postcard telling people about the rules for voting by mail. They're being sued because the Colorado Secretary of State said, no, this is bad information and the Postal Service needs to stop sending it out. The problem is that they're trying to weaponize the post office. The good thing is they're not being as successful as they thought. And that's why when I say we need to make a plan to vote early, we need to make a plan to vote early. Part of the challenge with the post office is the length of time it will take mail to be delivered. That was going to be a problem anyway because in part of COVID. But the earlier you go through the process, the more time you have to solve for any glitches in the system. And that's why I say make sure you have a backup plan and a backup to your backup plan. But start early so that if it doesn't work, you'll know in time to do the next piece. When you think about the West Coast and the fires, the thing to remember is Oregon, Washington State are both all vote by mail states, and they are already making adjustments to ensure that votes get counted, but they've been doing this for 20 years, so they know what to do. And California has become a vote by mail state. They still allow all other forms of voting. And so and they're all run by folks who are very intentional about inclusion and democracy. So all along the West Coast, we actually have good leaders who are doing their best to meet these crises and to ensure the right to vote is real. For example, in California, if your ballot is postmarked by election day, they give you up to 17 days for it to be delivered. That's an extraordinary accommodation that was made based on what they saw happening with the post office during the primary. And so across the country, we're seeing states make accommodations for the challenges of the post office. The other piece of it is, yes, there are states that are run by those who are supportive of breaking the bond between voters and vote by mail. But even in those states, they are starting to recognize that while they may be aiming at a certain community, the shrapnel is hitting everyone. So we have seen bipartisan efforts to ensure that vote by mail is actually made accessible and that the post office not game the system, because they realize that the #1 user of vote by mail prior to 2020 were white seniors over the age of 65.
Makes sense too, to make sure everybody has access. Okay, I'm getting a lot of these doomsday scenario type questions. I'm sure you've been hearing about this, thinking about this. Lots of people thinking, okay, vote by mail, everything's taking a long time, lots of voter suppression we are now noticing and aware of. So what are the scenarios that could potentially take place election day that might feel problematic, regardless, not necessarily based off of who anybody wants to win, but is there a chance we might not be able to know who the next president is or who some of the people are who are elected? And what are your thoughts about ways, if anything, folks can get involved to make sure that this is an election that's going to be called in a timely fashion?
Okay, so let's start with the reality that there is no way we're going to know who was elected on election night. We have to stop thinking about election as a ball game where there's a winner declared at the end of the game. Elections are now a process, and we are in an election season. Voting started in the United States on September 4th. That's when absentee ballots went out in North Carolina. And because we have 50 different states that have 50 different sets of rules, and that's not including the territories, we have to understand that the myth of election day as an event has to end. So that's number one. Number two, we have to recognize that delay does not mean that there is a problem. Delay often means that the process is working. And it's going to be a slower process because, unfortunately, the $3.6 billion that were identified as necessary in April to speed the process along, those dollars were never allocated by the Senate. And therefore, what would have taken a little bit of time is now going to take a whole lot of time. Number three, vote by mail works. It is not subject to fraud. It is not subject to chicanery. but it is time consuming. And so we have to recognize that, I think it's been called the red mirage, that there will be an in-person number that gets reported on election night that then signals one victor, and then there's sudden additional information, and that's going to lead to tumult and catastrophe in the streets. We can't stop people from trying to game the system, but what I have heard almost universally, and I've been on a number of calls with editorial boards, with the leaders of some of our major networks, and to a person, there is a strong commitment not to get drawn into calling or declaring a victor before we have enough information. And that's important. I point to my own election as an example. The election happened on November the 6th. The race wasn't called until November 16th. Now, my opponent did declare himself the victor in the middle, but luckily no one else did until we were able to get as many of those votes counted as possible. And it took litigation. And the reality is it's going to take litigation again. Both, I hate false equivalence, but I'll say this. There's a push by democracy advocates to ensure that as many eligible people as possible can be heard. There is also a push by more conservative-minded folks to use their words to limit who is allowed to vote. The issue is, do you want everyone who's entitled to the franchise to be heard, or do you not? And there is a pitched battle that is incredibly well-funded that is playing out right now. What's happened so far, though, is that in January of 2020, there were 34 states that permitted no excuses absentee voting. That was 68% of the states. As of today, it's 41 states, 80% of the country, or at least 80% of the states can vote by mail with no excuses. And so when we think about litigation as something inherently wrong, or legislation as something inherently problematic, we know heading into election night, the next day we will see lawsuits from multiple parties seeking to somehow adjust for the unprecedented system we find ourselves in. So what I urge is patience. I urge you to only take information from trusted sources. If the word opinion appears anywhere in the dialogue, ignore what they're saying. Only listen to people who actually have no skin in the game other than wanting to preserve our democracy. But the other reality is not everyone's going to abide by that. And this isn't 2000, this isn't 2016. We are in the midst of a maelstrom of challenges, and there will be heightened emotions and heightened reactions. And all we can do is conduct ourselves in the best way possible. And so what I also encourage folks to do is not to be prepared for, riots in the streets, but to get comfortable with dis-ease and to lock down on our patience. Because if we want democracy to work, especially in a pandemic, then we've got to wait out the process to make sure it works.
Yes, and if we rush it, it might not work. So patience all, that's great advice. So we have two questions as we're wrapping up. Let's start with this first one about courts. Not surprised to see some courts questions since it's one of our main issues. So from some of our Florida sections, they worked so hard to actually pass the Amendment 4 that restored voting rights to 1.4 million people that had previously been incarcerated. And now, on Friday, the 11th Circuit Court upheld the Florida legislature's imposition on fees that formerly incarcerated people have to pay in order to be able to vote, which sounds like a poll tax. So for these people who have done all this work to make these things happen, what advice do you have for them to keep going, and how can they make an impact in this particular fee that's now made it through the courts?
So sadly, you had a ballot initiative because the state refused to take action. The people then demanded change. Change was achieved and the state stepped back in and negated that change. The court system was the most expedient way to try to resolve these issues. Sadly, because of the conservative bent of the court, they were denied, and there is very little likelihood that the Supreme Court will reverse. The major tool in Florida, for example, is to once again use the ballot initiative system to clarify and to fix what has been put asunder by the state legislature and the governor and suborned by the courts. But nationwide, part of our responsibility is to understand that we need to use every mechanism at our disposal to achieve the ends that we seek within the frame of what a democracy permits. So if you live in a state that allows for ballot initiatives and you see a challenge that has gone unaddressed, do your best to engage your community members to solve that problem. That's what Desmond Meade did in Florida, and it worked. The problem is doing good does not mean that bad doesn't follow. And so our responsibility is a constant vigilance. One of the reasons I created Fair Fight and Fair Count and the Southern Economic Advancement Project is I believe in building infrastructure. So it's not about me, it's about the work we need to do. And no matter what I do next, that these infrastructures exist. And the same thing has to be true about any of the change we want to see. Because any change that challenges power is always going to be met by a pendulum swing against what we've done. And so our responsibility is to prepare for the pendulum to swing and be ready to push it back again. And that means the right to vote, the right to ballot initiatives if you live in a state that permits them, but most importantly, educating our communities about what's at stake and what is possible if we win.
Yeah, and since we were kind of on the topic of courts, let me just add a follow-up question in here around federal courts and the Supreme Court specifically. Can you just explain a little bit of the ramifications of 2013 Shelby County v. Holder and how that's continuing to play out today, and whether there's any other, we got a lot of courts people here. So are there any other cases we should be following, particularly targeting people of color, that we should know about right now?
Okay, so very quick. 1965 Voting Rights Act was reauthorized multiple times, actually 25 years in, and then again, so it was reauthorized by President Reagan and President Bush. What the 65 Act did was require that the Constitution actually be followed by the states, and that if there was going to be any impediment to voting that was imposed upon communities of color, there were a slate of things you had to do, including pre-clearance. 2013, in the Shelby case, the Supreme Court said racism is done, everybody's a good actor now, so we're going to eliminate the formula that essentially applied Section 5, that pre-clearance requirement. That's the section that applied the requirement to everyone, or to the states that were covered. And so with the evisceration of Section 5 by eliminating essentially the formula in Section 4, all you're left with is Section 2. And Section 2 says, so Section 5 said, we're going to stop you before you do harm. Section 2 says, if you can prove harm, we can't do anything about what happened, but we'll try to make sure it doesn't happen again. Well, there is a case that is moving its way through the courts, and I can get you the direct information, that seeks to eviscerate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. If that happens, that essentially eliminates the protections offered by the Voting Rights Act. Number 2, there have been a series of cases. Shelby was the first one in 2013. Then you have the Evanwell case in 2016 and the Rucho case in 2019. Read together, the only prohibition in redistricting, the only protections that exist for communities of color are the protections that say that racial gerrymandering is not permitted, that it is unlawful and unconstitutional, and it's what was used to overturn districts in Texas, North Carolina. There's a little bit of changes in Florida, and I think in Pennsylvania. Here's the problem. Remember what I said about the census? Well, if the census is inaccurate and they use what's called statistical imputation to erase communities of color, which is the intent, then you don't have a problem with racial gerrymandering if everyone looks white. And if the evidentiary basis for an accusation of racial gerrymandering is an inaccurate census, even if there is an administration that is in favor of communities of color, they are bound by the same evidence that exists in the census. And so if you know there is a Black community that has been imputed to be white, even if you can bring in Instagram photos of every single person, the court still has to treat that community as white for the purposes of racial gerrymandering, which means that this could eviscerate protections from racial gerrymandering for a decade. And the consequences of that, it means that the courts will have no authority because they have to use the same evidence and the same data that allowed the gerrymander to occur.
Wow. So there's a lot to do, clearly, for everyone to make an impact. Just a final question here. Somebody wrote this when they registered in. They want to know what they can tell their teenage children about the future because of everything going on in this moment. What advice do you have for them?
So I get asked a lot, do I have hope? And I don't actually do hope or not hope or optimism or pessimism. I call myself an ameliorist. I think the glass is half full. It's just probably poisoned and I've got to find the antidote. And so I like to live with a bit of both. But the reason I do the work I do, not despite 2018, but because of 2018, is that I am the great-great-great-granddaughter of slaves in Mississippi. I am the great-great-granddaughter of sharecroppers who were not permitted to own the land that they worked. I'm the great-granddaughter of domestic workers. I am the granddaughter of cooks who worked at a university, a public university, their children were legally not permitted to attend. And I'm the daughter of civil rights activists who as teenagers believed in their rights so much that they both became the first people in their families to go to college. My dad was the first man and my mom's the only person in her family to finish high school. And in 2018, I became the first Black woman in American history to be a nominee for a major party for governor, and I came within a hair's breadth of having that job. My belief in the future exists because I know what my past was. And I believe the future is going to be shaped by those who show up. It's going to be shaped by those who are protesting in the streets, but who also know to protest at the ballot box and who know that their participation is not bounded by anything other than their enthusiasm and their commitment to building the future they want. I believe in a possible future that is brighter and better because I know what I could have been. I know what could have happened. And as long as I have this platform and this capacity, then I believe anything can happen, and that's my mission.
Wow. What a note for us to close on. The future is shaped by those who show up. We have so many more questions here. I wish you could stay with us all day, but we all have important work to do to make our voting plans and get everybody registered to vote and out to vote and to do this work for the long haul. So Stacey, it's just been an absolute pleasure speaking with you this afternoon. Your insight and expertise on the power of our vote was just so helpful, and it's more important than ever. And we know at NCJW that our vote is our voice, and we're going to continue to fight to make sure everyone can access this most critical right that they have. And so thank you again for being with us here today. We're inspired by you. We're better prepared to protect and promote the vote because of you. And we are collectively all in for voting.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you. So as everyone else is still here, it wouldn't be an NCJW call if we didn't give you a little homework as a result of what we just heard. So after everything we heard from Stacey, it's clear we cannot sit this election out. And so as she mentioned, we have to fill out the census first and foremost to make sure you've done it. You can even check that off today. The deadline's been accelerated, so it's really important everybody does that as quickly as possible. You got to create a voting plan and then a backup plan and a backup plan, as she said. And if your vote plan includes voting by mail, make sure to request a mail-in ballot. And one of the other things we're recommending folks do is to get out the vote through NCJW's Vote Forward campaign, which is a letter writing campaign. Literally, it'll give you everything you need. You just have to bring your own stamps, and then you'll be able to personally send letters to people who are less likely to vote, telling them why it matters, which statistically means they're going to be more likely to vote from receiving this. You'll get links with all of this, or maybe they'll put it in the chat. And if you're healthy and able, this is a great time to sign up to be a poll worker. Earlier this year, they were predicting about a 250,000 person shortage because the majority of poll workers tend to be older in this country and they're the most vulnerable for COVID. So if you've been a poll worker and can't be one, consider asking a family member to do it in your honor or a friend. And if you're able, if you're healthy, this is a great way to make sure voter suppression doesn't happen the day of. Sign up to be a poll worker. And as always, I have to say, there are many, many great ways you can volunteer with your time and with your energy. And there's great ways that you can actually donate your funds. So we would be honored if you would consider making a donation to the National Council of Jewish Women in honor of our work combating voter suppression and protecting and promoting the vote. It's definitely a way to get involved in making an impact. And then just to close, I just want to thank everyone here for your participation and great questions. It sounds like that we capped out at some point, so we put this on Facebook Live as well. And if you didn't get enough of Stacey Abrams already, you've all been invited to a special screening of her film. It comes out later this week or weekend, but you can see it first. So they're going to put the link in the chat. It's the All-In Fight for Democracy that begins at 6 o'clock Eastern Time. And you can get the link to register at ncjw.org/NCJwebinars. And we hope we'll start at 6 o'clock. We'll be using the hashtag #AllInForVoting. So if you're watching, make sure to tweet and share on social so we can follow along. And then if we go back to the previous slide, just some of the upcoming things. Let's continue this conversation about the connection of racial justice, among other things. We'll be chatting with Yavila McCoy and Eric Ward on Tuesday, September 29th. And then if you want to make a voting plan with a bunch of other fabulous people around the country, NCJW, Jewish Women International, and Hadassah together are presenting Jewish Women Across America Unite to Vote, which will be a Shabbat-themed celebration of voting on Friday, October 16th. And we hope you save the date for our virtual gala and Hanukkah celebration honoring Tina Chen and Senator Tammy Duckworth and several of our amazing advocates from the field. All of this can be found on our website, ncjw.org. And with that, I guess I just want to say, especially for those who celebrate, this Friday is Rosh Hashanah, the new year. So Shana Tova to everyone. May this be a year of goodness, of health, of safety, and of righteous action. Thank you so much for joining.